Welcome, everyone. My name is Roz Engel, and you've come to the World Affairs Council of New Jersey's webinar with Greg Treverton on COVID as a wicked problem. Just first, let me welcome everyone. We're so glad that you could make it tonight. We had a really great turnout, and we think it'll be a great conversation. We had a bunch of people also provide some questions in advance, which we will get to a little bit later. But I want to thank you now for that participation up front. I thought I would just start with a very brief introduction, myself and the World Affairs Council, and then we'll quickly turn to Greg. So as I said, my name is Roz Engel, and I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Jersey. For those of you who don't know me, I am a New Jersey native, a proud New Jersey native, growing up in Morris County and then raising my family in Essex County. At the same time, I have also spent a lot of time going back and forth to Washington, D.C. as part of my professional life. And over the years, I've held positions in national security and intelligence and foreign policy and economic policy. I currently teach at the U.S. Naval Academy, and I also have a non-resident appointment at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The World Affairs Council of New Jersey is really quite new. We were founded last year, and we started with a light schedule of programs this year. Our mission is to provide community-based programs on global affairs, and we're pleased to be an official member of the World Affairs Councils of America, which is a national network of more than 90 councils across more than 40 states, all dedicated to this broad mission. Although foreign policy can seem very far removed from our daily lives, it affects all of us, as we now actually have really learned in the wake of COVID-19. For its part, New Jersey is a highly global place and a highly global state. We have more than 20% of our population is born outside the US. We're a hub of global trade with the busiest port on the East Coast. We live amidst extremely dense and complex infrastructure, digital and physical, that connects us with people all around the world. At the same time, if you live in New Jersey, you know what it's like to live in a bubble. We all live in our small towns and our municipalities, and we can be a little disconnected, even just from each other. But we're also very educated, we're energetic, and our goal here at the Council is to help facilitate personal learning, civic engagement, helping people connect the dots between their local worlds and the bigger world, and helping us build ties with each other. So that's my introduction. I just want to let you know a little bit about what to expect tonight. We're going to run our program for about an hour. It's roughly divided into thirds. So we'll have a little warm up and scene setting between me and Greg. Then we'll go to some pre-submitted questions that you all sent us. And then we'll try some open audience questions. We have a very large audience. We expect close to 90 people tonight, which is fabulous, but a little too many to have everybody unmuted, so I hope you can appreciate. So everyone is actually just muted. On our open audience segment, what we'll do is we'll take questions via the chat room. So you can chat and send me a question or comment directly. And when we get to that point, a little bit later in the program, we will be taking those questions too. So feel free to send them as they come up. Now, just to turn to our speaker, we feel really fortunate to have Greg Treverton with us tonight. He's participating from his home in California. I had the great privilege of working with Greg at the National Intelligence Council, and I learned an enormous amount from him about strategic intelligence, the intelligence community, history of the intelligence community, fantastic writing, all kinds of things. So a great experience. Greg's had a fascinating career. He's led several research centers at the RAND Corporation. He has chaired, as I said, the National Intelligence Council. That was from September 2014 to January 2017. He's taught at several universities, including his present appointment at the University of Southern California. He's written many books and articles. Divided States is one, and then his more recent is Truth to Power, a history of the National Intelligence Council, and that came out in May of 2019. And he's now working hard at advancing the policy dialogue globally on emerging technologies through his leadership at the Global Technopolitics Forum. So we really feel very fortunate to have Greg here with us tonight to share some of his thinking and his wisdom and his perspectives. So Greg, now we're going to get to you. Thanks very much for being here. Let me just start with a really, let's unmute you. Sorry. Can you, shall I do that? Can you unmute yourself? Nope. I need to do it. Okay, sorry about that, Greg. I seem to have all the controls here and not enough expertise in Zoom. Okay, so let me get back to our question for you. So I thought we used to start with kind of an easy one, which is, what is a wicked problem? It's a term that kind of comes up. It's used in the analytic community, a little bit in the policy community. Do you think it's useful for describing COVID-19? I know you have some other ways you like to think about these things.
Well, that's great. Before, let me say how nice it is to be here and be with you and to participate in the creation of what is an important place. So thank you. I want to say that it was so much fun to work with you. I didn't get to hire you, but when I was hiring a National Intelligence Officer for Economics in the 1990s, my main criterion was, could that person go toe-to-toe in economics with Larry Summers, who was then the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and you would have fit that bill entirely.
I'm not sure, but thank you for that.
In any case, it's great to be here. I have, I think, bored my colleagues, and I hope I won't bore this group, by distinguishing kind of three categories of intelligence problems. One is puzzles. Those are things that have an answer. We may not know it. So during the Cold War, a lot of puzzles about the Soviet Union, things that had answers, but they were secretive and we didn't know them. North Korea is a lot like that today. The second category is mysteries. Those are things that don't have an answer. They're iffy, they depend. They may depend on our actions, among other things, but they're iffy. So the best you can do with those is try and give the best answer you can, try and frame those mysteries. But typically for mysteries, we have some sense for what to look for, the variables. We may have some history. We may have a little theory. So we don't know what Russia's inflation rate is going to be this year, but we have an idea of what causes inflation rates to be where they are. Then the third category is really wicked problems. I sometimes refer to them as complexities. And there I think of them as kind of mysteries plus, where they're mysteries, but we may see new actors interacting in ways we haven't seen before. We may not have, usually don't have much history. So when you think of the early days after 9/11, terrorism was very much a wicked problem or a complexity, because we were seeing these groups we hadn't seen before. They were popping up. There wasn't a lot of history, not a lot of theory. And so over time, we tried, in effect, to turn a complexity or wicked problem more into a mystery. So I find that distinction useful. As we think about the coronavirus, what strikes me is it has elements of all three of those, right? There are lots of puzzles to solve, the big one being who's got it, who's been in contact with that person, can we trace those?
Yeah.
There are lots of mysteries, like how do the opening up of the economy and the virus, how are they going to interact? And that's a mystery. We have some ideas, some theory, some epidemiology. We also have some analogies with 1918, so we wouldn't be surprised if, as we open, there is a second and worse wave next winter if we open up in ways that aren't entirely right. And then it is a wicked problem, and there are things, it's systemic and in ways that are sometimes good and sometimes complicating. We get unintended side effects. Fascinating but sad to see private hospitals close or go out of business because they're no longer doing the things people are paying for, right? They're basically, everybody's working on COVID-19. So I think it's really what's fascinating terrible but fascinating about it is it really does combine elements of all those kinds of problems.
Yeah, and it sort of you start to think about the ways in which it's either parallel to or not parallel to, previous events. I think we've all read a little bit about a plague or two at this point. We've kind of tried to wrap our head around, the 1918 flu pandemic. And you mentioned even 9/11, right, as this massive shock that really kind of forced people to think about a kind of a new threat and in a new way. How useful do you find some of the parallels that you're reading about or seeing? Do you think they teach us very much, or do we have to be more careful about them?
Well, I think they all teach us something. The plagues have been obviously talked about a lot. That for me is hard to make relevant, though it is relevant in the fact that even then, with the limited globalization there was, and at that point, it spread very rapidly. The same about smallpox in the New World and other things. So that does remind us that this globalization of disease it goes very far back. The flu pandemic seems to me more instructive. What's interesting about it is that it obviously caught us by surprise. And the difference there, I think, we learned something, as I suggested earlier, about the interrelationship between the economy and the pandemic. But what's strikingly different there, it seems to me, is we didn't really understand it. And we didn't understand what to do about it. In that sense, this is really quite different. 9/11 and this pandemic seem to me similar in the sense that in both cases, we knew it was coming, right? A whole set of blue ribbon panels in the late 90s said, the terrorists are coming, they're going to do it here, it's going to happen here. So we had plenty of strategic warning. This case, also lots of strategic warning happened to us before. We had H1N1 in 2009, all the others. So good strategic warning. The big difference is that in this case, we had abundant tactical warning in a way we didn't have in 9/11, which in some ways makes this case even more tragic than others, because it didn't have to turn out like this. It could have been much less dramatic and much less costly in lives and treasure.
Yeah, and on that note, I think we talked yesterday, and I said, I might throw this question at you. But do you think COVID-19 will go down as an intelligence success because of what you mentioned, which is there's been lots of strategic warning in terms of things like the Global Trends Report, which, has gone back, every 4 years and is routinely, grabbed this as like, this is something, a real disruptor, something we should really be worried about. And then there's some tactical warning. But even with all that warning, we've been left with, obviously the political leadership that didn't really hear the warning or didn't take it seriously enough. So is that an intelligence failure or an intelligence success?
Our former boss, Jim Clapper, used to say there were only two kinds of outcomes in Washington: intelligence failures and policy successes, right?
This is true.
This is an intelligence success and a policy failure. Obviously, the intelligence is quotation marks. It's not just what the intelligence community does, because in some sense, for something like this, a health issue, intelligence plays a role, but a subsidiary role to the medical institutions, CDC and FDA and those. But there was plenty of warning. In that sense, it's sort of the classic warning problem magnified, right? You can have good warning, but if people are disinclined or have other reasons or worried or think it's going to be too expensive or too expensive politically, then you get a kind of willful not listening to the warning. And that seemed to be what happened here. You add to that the way bureaucracies work. So what needed to happen early on in January was for CDC and FDA to begin letting all these labs build tests. The Germans had tests stockpiled before they had a single confirmed case. But the way bureaucracy works is unless you get some signal from the top, you're not going to take risks at a middle level. You're going to play by the books. And so we got a combination of inattention or negative attention at the top with the way bureaucracy generally works. And in this case, it's been pretty tragic.
Yeah, I agree. So, in terms of wicked problems, getting back to that for a moment, and as you said, it's clearly about complexity. And if we think of wicked problems as sort of these things where you just have this kind of impenetrable connectedness, right? It's just like so many things are going on. Um, how can we start to think about the ways in which, say, different domains? So let's say we cognitively we sort of take domains and we think about them separately: economics, national security, politics, technology, environment. And then you have a shock like this where they just all get mixed together. They're, bumping into each other, and the shock is kind of reverberating across all of them at once. How do you think about which domains are most salient in terms of how to think about the ways in which they're intersecting? Are you kind of more or less fascinated by the intersection of any of those domains and think that they're particularly important?
Well, the obvious intersections between the economy and the disease, right? That's
Mhm.
on everybody's mind. I think
Yeah.
the interesting other ones are, there's an argument out there that says, well, mostly what's going to happen is this is just going to accelerate or exacerbate ongoing trends.
Right.
So we've seen a lot of economic nationalism going on. We've seen a lot of political nationalism. We've seen a lot of populist tendencies mixed with that political nationalism. We have a U.S.-China set of relations that seems to be getting worse and worse. So the sort of, I suppose, the null hypothesis would be those things merely continue and maybe get worse. What's interesting for me is, are there possibilities that might not be true, that we'll get not big discontinuities, but changes, that this will force us to realize that the way we're doing business, both internationally and at home, just aren't working, and that we need to do something different. I mean, plainly, the crisis has laid bare that we have a very expensive and very ineffective healthcare system, which
Hmm.
ought to lead to dramatic changes. It's also driven home that we have a set of international institutions that's badly suited to the problems we now face. It's much too dominated by nation states that were important after World War II. It's
Hmm.
much too uncongenial for the big private sector actors that now are more and more important in our lives. So those are the things that's kind of the big question on my mind, whether this will make for, whether it'll jostle continuity in interesting ways that
Yeah.
might lead us to some creative solutions.
Yeah, I was just looking at, it was an article about um, robotics and robots taking over various jobs that are very hard to do right now in COVID. And so it makes, it's this intersection of technology and automation, and then COVID coming in and kind of intersecting with and creating, an issue within a job market. So just these, constantly intersecting issues, I think are really just fascinating.
It's
Um,
interesting.
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
You were good enough to mention the Global Technopolitics Forum.
Yeah.
One of the things we're focused on it. Isn't it interesting that the big tech companies that a few months ago were being pilloried are now the relative heroes of this crisis, because we depend on them for this, for study, for delivery.
Yeah.
And so that ought to be an opening to think more creatively about their role in our societies, their role in our democracies, and their role in international affairs, because they have become geopolitical actors in their own right.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Last question for me, and I would maybe we can get to our audience questions because you have a lot of good ones. Are there any current hotspots, things that were kind of really concerned you, let's say 3 to 4 months ago, that you think are really very different in the wake of COVID-19, things that have been kind of like pushed off their normal trajectory? Or any that you really think of as, things come to mind pretty quickly of things that were going on that are going to be affected by COVID-19.
A lot of the things that were going on, I mean, all the economic things are on people's minds. The idea that, people are now paying people to take oil is quite a change from even a few months ago. So those kinds of things will surprise us, and will have, it seems to me, effects we don't quite expect.
Mhm.
It'll be bad enough for the Saudis, probably worse for the Russians, though the Russians really can't cut production, so they'll find ways to sneakily continue production. But for some of the second order powers like Nigeria and others, this will be a really big deal for them. I think for me, the biggest worry, and this is not a surprise, is that it just seems to me this is going to be, it's bad enough for us, but it's going to be terrible for the poorer countries.
Yeah.
Think of the countries in Africa and South Asia where people are crowded together, where healthcare is bad. I worry that there'll be just chunks of those places that in effect cease to exist.
Yeah.
Now, the IMF is actually more optimistic than that. They think that the developing countries, the emerging countries, but maybe not the poorest of the emerging, will recover faster and better than we do in the rich country world. But I'm skeptical.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you saw this, but the UN World Food Program came out with a warning. I think it was today, or maybe it was yesterday, warning of multiple famines in their quote, biblical proportions. 265 million people could suffer from acute hunger by the end of the year. And it reminds me of some of the discussion around Arab Spring, where there was, thought that high food prices and food insecurity was one of the drivers of some of the instability across North Africa and the Middle East. And so,
It was striking even for me over the weekend. I did some work with a group trying to do something about it. Turned out that you can't find milk in grocery stores much these days. Meanwhile, the milk producers were being told to destroy all this milk because they couldn't get it to market. It was mostly, again, the systems problem. And since the truckers were reluctant to do it, it was reverberated through the system in ways that ought to have been fixable. But a reminder that it is really very much a system, and therefore you have all these unintended side effects, second order effects.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch. All right, so I think it's a good time to maybe move on to a couple audience questions. I hope people don't mind. I am going to use your name if you supplied your name when you wrote down your question. So I'm going to start with a question from Mark Chandler. And he asked, do you think the pandemic meaningfully changes the broad geopolitical trajectory? Will it accelerate or simply reinforce the existing path of power relationships domestically, internationally?
It's a great question. As I said, I think that in the short run, it's likely just to exacerbate the things that are going on. We've seen that all of the, Europe has been, European countries, European Union countries stopped even transferring medical supplies to each other. That kind of disaggregation, that kind of disagreement, we've seen that across the world. So in the short run, it does seem to me that we're likely to get these kind of continuation, maybe even an acceleration. My former colleague Richard Haas has written about that in Foreign Affairs, maybe even acceleration of existing trends. As I said, I'm hopeful that that'll be not forever, that'll be short run, and then we'll get through it, at least mitigated in some respects. But I worry that will be the short run tendency. I mean, after all, this is a time when we ought to be cooperating closely with the Chinese, and we're doing the opposite. We're making them the villains of the piece. Now, to be sure, they haven't exactly been helpful since they were dissembling themselves and more recently have been engaged in their own kind of disinformation campaign, which seems to be only plays into the worst instincts in our politics. So short run seems to me continuation is going on, whether they're longer term straws in the wind that might be helpful. I want to be hopeful about that because we have such a demonstration that the existing ways we're doing business aren't working, both globally and nationally, and that ought to spur us to do better.
Yeah, I do worry, I guess, we worry about this where you think something's continuous, right? Because it's easy to see how something can just keep going in the same way. It's like cognitively, right? We're sort of more set up to see continuity. And it's always discontinuity that gets us, right? It's those breaks that we have a hard time seeing come and then coping with when they get here. So I do wonder in my mind, are we really, is it just a continuation of the trend a little faster, a little slower, or are we actually seeing a break in trend?
I think we will see some breaks. We know from intelligence and social science that the people least likely to see discontinuities are the experts, right? Because they know exactly why things are as they are, and the world for them is overdetermined. But there will be some discontinuities. We'll see some bad ones, I think, but maybe we'll actually have some good ones as well. So that's maybe it's more of a hope for me than an assessment, but that's kind of where I come out.
Yeah. We had another question, and this is from Kathleen Pereira. How should we address the competition between rich and poor countries? I think you sort of touched on this a bit, for the same needed medical supplies. How can we ensure that these needy populations also get what they need?
It really would be nice if we'd had some real global cooperation on this. We've had the opposite, basically. We've had a G7 meeting that was just, pro forma, didn't do anything. The cooperation, we're not cooperating with anybody. The Chinese are not being particularly helpful. They're trying to reap propaganda and diplomatic advantage from this, which is understandable, but not very helpful. Mm-hmm. So what would have been required, it seems to me, would have been nice, is if somebody, could have been us, but it wasn't, had really convened the group of 7 and others in a serious way and said, okay, we've got to cooperate among ourselves, because in some ways the bigger problem is with these poor countries. So everybody's going to, rather than have a scramble for these products and things, it would have been nice to at least have some effort to be cooperative. Now, again, the Chinese haven't exactly been helpful, since they had stockpiled lots of stuff, maybe even beyond their needs, and then they've sort of given it away as diplomatic favors. But it does just, again, takes me back to the point that we are in a position that we shouldn't be in. We shouldn't be facing something that is a threat to all of humanity and be going at it very individually, even competitively.
Yeah, I mean, in that vein, we also have the various export controls or export bans, from different countries. I think it's India and maybe several others have essentially exported the ban of certain kinds of medical equipment, medical supplies, and it's understandable, right? Like, you have populations; these are domestic political leaders. They can't be seen to be exporting things that they think their population might need. But it's a little pretty close to beggar thy neighbor type of policy when you get down to it, and it keeps going on and on and on. It's never checked. It's going to be, it can spiral into other things.
When you think about the European Union, where even the members of the European Union have been stopping exports of medical things to their partners, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
like our states competing for, as they have been, having to compete for protective equipment and ventilators and all those critical things.
Yeah, and this inability to coordinate or communicate and say, well, we need it now, but we'll reassure people it'll be available for you if you need it, but that does not seem to be happening. From Zoe Compricos, how do events like pandemics interact with national security, and whose domain is prevention?
All these good questions.
Yeah. And I'm going to extend that just to some. How do pandemics also interact with intelligence?
Right.
Yeah.
I think pandemics, if you think about, I remember when I was running a Center for Global Risk at the RAND Corporation, now 15 years ago, maybe a little more, but we did an exercise and we binned threats to the United States in 3 categories: nuisance, serious, and existential. This must have been 2004, 2005. We made the bin terrorism. This probably wouldn't have been a popular choice politically, but we called it a nuisance. The only thing in the existential category was pandemics. So I think it's been clear for a very long time that pandemics are a dramatic threat to national security, and that they're probably the one thing out there that could really dramatically change American way of life. That was our sense in 2004-05. Now, what's interesting about pandemics is if they're a threat, they're probably, or can be, as far as we can tell, this one was a threat without a threatener. Nobody intended to do all this. It just happened, maybe by lab accident or maybe by the wet markets in China. But so far, it seems that it was basically something that got loose. So it was a threat without a threatener. And that does imply, it seems to me, a different approach to the problem. You're not sort of looking at who's the bad guys to go after, as you are in the terrorism case, but ought to be thinking about ways to work with partners to deal with a threat that affects us all.
And how about intelligence? I mean, is this an intelligence problem, or is this, a medical public health problem? I mean, how do we sort of disentangle different responsibilities across the government?
I think intelligence has a role to play, but probably a secondary role. Uh, a small commercial for the NIC. The NIC had been talking about pandemics for a long time. Indeed, its 2004 version of Global Trends, which was, I guess, Global Trends 2020, talked about pandemics and described basically our current world, where global communication shut down, globalization shut down, economy shut down. So it wasn't as though we weren't thinking about these things. But I think it's primarily a secondary role for intelligence, that the primary actors need to be the medical people, the CDCs and others. And one of the things I've always struck by parallels between medicine and intelligence. One of the interesting ones for me is, in principle, once you identify something like COVID, then every medical person in the world is a collector. Right? So you have a built-in network. And that didn't quite work in this case. It didn't work quickly enough. But there were, CDC people co-located with WHO in China. And so there was some knowledge pretty early on. But in that sense, I think this is primarily a medical issue, but with intelligence having a role to play, because it obviously is international. And it's something that intelligence wants to be trying to at least warn about, think about, and keep on the agenda.
I know you were at the NIC when the Ebola virus hit West Africa. Were there particularly interesting lessons learned, not just necessarily from intelligence, but from the way in which that problem was identified, and the policy process that went into dealing with it? Since I think you were there, I think you saw a lot of it. It might be interesting to hear your perspective.
It was an interesting episode for me. It began in Africa, and obviously was a foreign policy issue. National Security Advisor Susan Rice was very interested in it, very concerned about it. And so she turned to the intelligence community to help her understand it. And so we did a lot of the NIC predictive analytics in Africa of where Ebola was going. Then what was interesting to me was, once we had domestic cases, then overnight, of course, it became a domestic issue, right? The foreign dimension was less important, as always, and the domestic dimension was very important. But that left us in the intelligence community, in some ways, kind of holding the ring, being the convening group for what was increasingly a domestic issue. And I thought that was interesting. It was important then, because the main connection, as you know, of the intelligence community to the policy process is through the National Security Council. And so it would have been nice this time around to have that connection. Been a lot of debate about the disestablishment of the health unit in the National Security Council, but something like that's really important, because that's a natural partner for intelligence, but it's also a natural, easier partner for some of the domestic agencies than probably intelligence directly is. The NIC is unusual in that sense. At various times, the NIC has had a CDC officer as a member of the National Intelligence Council, which is great.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to kind of some questions about information and around COVID. So this is from Elizabeth Wishnick. Timely reporting of new diseases and accurate information about their spread is crucial to combating them. But within individual governments, there are political pressures to downplay the incidence of disease and incentives to spread disinformation about the origins of the disease. How can wicked problems such as global pandemics be resolved in the absence of agreement about facts and absence of a commitment to transparency in disease reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the answer is probably can't do it without those things, right? And we've seen the price we've paid, going to pay. This is probably, unfortunately, going to go down, it seems to me, as in terms of needless loss of life, it may well be the worst failure in American history. So we've seen the price. I mean, and what I suppose if I'm being hopeful, maybe one of the things that will come out of this is people, not everybody, we're always going to have people that don't think any science is science and think it's all a fake and a hoax and all the rest. but that maybe the Fauci's of this crisis will make people think that, well, maybe these scientists and experts have something to tell us. Because if we don't listen to them, we see the result. And trying to be more transparent. Nobody's been transparent. The Chinese started by being not transparent. So it's not as though this is just our fault, but transparency, sharing, those things are critical. If the Chinese had gotten us more data earlier, that would have helped. If once they'd given us the genome sequence in January, then we were off to the races, but weren't exactly, didn't do all the things we needed to test and then track and trace the disease. We didn't have to shut down the economy if we'd done all that, but we had to do it 2 months earlier.
I was just on your point about tracing and contact tracing. You know, there's been some controversy around the technologies that are being deployed, these apps, in doing contact tracing because of the possible invasion of privacy. So I know some of the Asian economies have been a little more willing to push those apps out and require people to use them. But I was just reading that a European consortium sort of trying to develop these apps has kind of just fallen apart over these very debates about privacy, with, you know, some of the folks saying, listen, this is too intrusive, this isn't, you know, protecting users, we know too much about them, we don't know where this data is going to be stored. I mean, what do you make of this need, this tension between privacy, right, and protecting people's privacy, and yet government needing information? And of course, the intelligence community is always stuck in this issue, right, of collecting, but doing it in a way that's legal and you know, acceptable politically and everything else.
Yeah, no, it's in some ways it seems to me a replay of post 9/11, right? Mm-hmm. Therefore, big privacy concerns at play, but in the short run, maybe even the not so short run, people feeling that they're quite prepared to trade privacy for a little more security, in this case, a little more health security. So that's my worry, that the things out there in our country, we have Google and Microsoft collaborating to do cell phone apps that would let people know when they've been around people that have contracted or might have contracted the disease, ostensibly voluntarily giving the information. But that's another sign. We now have Amazon with these thermal cameras at all the entrances of their plants. You can imagine that when we reopen, that's going to be the case for everything. Restaurants and sporting events, that you're going to have your temperature taken before you get in. So my worry, but also my guess, is that people are afraid, understandably afraid, and will continue to be prepared to sacrifice what we would have thought of as privacy for security, in this case, health. As we've seen over the last 20 years, our notions of privacy have so dramatically changed in any case that I suspect this latest thing is just the next phase or next set of drips here. And it's interesting to ask whether there at some point will be a kind of a more major backlash. I guess I think it's also convenient and so useful, if you're worried about your safety, as people are, that people do rather willingly sacrifice privacy for security.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that we may, especially as, you know, I don't know, with the second wave, if it comes, I mean, people may just be like, we have to know, we need more information, and I've got to be willing to do that. From Cyro Averbach, could you please comment on economic supply chains and if the US will reduce its future dependence on China and other Asian countries, especially in more sensitive industries like defense, healthcare, biotech, information technology, and communications?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes to all those questions. Yes, supply chains, I think, are one of the biggest deals, and they're one you can pretty easily, it seems to me, foresee. People are going to try and shorten supply chains, localize them to the extent they can. I think we've already seen the move out of China. There was all talk of disconnecting even before all this. So I think that will all be embedded with people seeking to bring supply chains home. Now there will be limits to how much you can do it. Notice Mr. Trump the other day, or the Pentagon, I guess, exhorting the Mexicans to open some plants because they're making things that we need for defense products, right? So, I mean, somebody said today to me, he said, there takes 26,000 parts to make a car. It only takes one part to unmake it, right? So the supply chain problem is a big and real one, but I think certainly the temptations will be to bring it closer to home, to have more alternatives, and probably for some products. I mean, it does strike many people, I think, that our dependence on China for so many pharmaceuticals, China and then maybe India, may be dangerous. Now that often in the past has set in motion the most egregious kind of buy in America things that are very economically inefficient. But there will be that temptation this time around, I think. And I think a lot of companies are going to do it in their own interest because they've seen the difficulty this has caused even in their own business. So yeah, a lot of shortening and trying to bring home supply lines.
This is kind of a related question. It's from Andres Buja. And it's basically, how can it happen that the US let pharmaceuticals, essential for the armed services, be outsourced to China and India? I guess this question wanted to ask you a little bit about industrial policy in the United States. We've had these conversations now, like for decades, how much do we protect the defense industrial base? It involves semiconductor, steel, irons, essential materials. It comes up with the CFIUS process sometimes. Where do you think we are with that? For a long time, kind of our free market forces really sort of pushed us and nudged us away from some of these industrial policies, but it feels like the pendulum is swinging back.
I think so. I think it's, and we've seen bad mistakes happen in the past when we've tried to do these things. The Buy America policies and all those were often pretty inefficient. But we've had a period when overall it seems to me we've tried to maximize economic efficiency, and that has led to these outcomes like buying where it's cheap in India and China. Great in good times, but then you rue it in bad times when you can't get those things or they're difficult to. So I think this will spur again some thinking about industrial policy. I hope we put it in a somewhat broader context, not just how do we make sure that pharmaceuticals that the military needs get produced here or someplace we can count on, like Canada, but that we put it in a broader context and ask, since we're going to have an economy that's flat, dead for a while, we get to rebuild it. And it's not inevitable, it seems to me, that we have to rebuild it in the same old way. We might actually say, this has been a period of sort of vulture capitalism driven by short-term shareholder gain. And maybe we ought to try and rethink that. So this could be an opportunity, it seems to me, to rethink even some basics about the nature of the economy.
Great. I'm going to go to a question from Mary Cynthia Orgy. In the face of COVID-19 pandemic and its potential effects, what do you think will be the future of diplomacy after COVID-19? Specifically, what changes will the pandemic impose on diplomats and the diplomatic world?
I've been struck for the last 20 years, basically, that diplomacy hasn't changed as much as I thought it would or should. I mean, in a certain sense, it's a paradox and a sad paradox that the last few years have been a world set up for diplomacy, but we haven't done much of it or done it very well.
Yeah.
How we do it, I've thought, now we've got all these modern communications. We have these embassies in lots of places that mostly protect themselves. They're mostly in the force protection business where people don't get out and about nearly as much as they would like. They do in some places. And we saw from WikiLeaks, that was the best advertisement for the State Department I'd ever seen, right? Because these diplomats were out there talking to people, and goodness, they could actually even write. They wrote rather well. So it was a good advertisement. And that's important, but it seems to me this is probably also going to mean that diplomats find it less easy to circulate, that travel is less. Yeah. But now I think this makes it look more of a piece with global business, where I expect that many global businesses will say, we really need to take that trip around the world or halfway around the world? Can't we do it on Zoom? Now the technology, as we found here, is only okay, but it's going to get a lot better. And soon we'll have virtual technology that makes it impossible for me to know that you, Roz, aren't in the same room with me. So that's going to get better and better. And I think that'll have a big effect, a technology effect on both global business, and I think it'll affect diplomacy as well, that we can do much more of this virtually and not have to spend so much money basically having diplomats be protected in dangerous foreign places.
Yeah. Although I am struck by, I agree with you. I am struck though, you know, we talked about this, we've been connecting more and more with people from our past, you know, through Zoom and other things, and that connectivity has been really nice. But everyone I've connected with on Zoom or somebody I had met in person first, you know, that in-person connection is still really profound. And it's the foundation for, you know, can be what a lifetime, you know, of Zoom. But I don't know, I think to be determined, right? Whether you can make
Yeah, no, you're certainly right. I used to say in my intelligence incarnations, tell folks at the NIC that, you know, in this virtual world, personal contact is paradoxically all the more important, right? I think you're exactly right that you can do Zoom once you have some relationships. When I was at RAND 20 years ago, I used to tell people, pick up the phone, right? Call your colleague in Washington. Don't send an email, because people will say things over email that they would never say on the telephone, right? And
Yeah.
get these huge feuds going that all you need to do is pick up the phone and have a conversation. So I mean, I think you're exactly right. The personal contact will continue to be important.
Yeah. I think some people would like us to look ahead and maybe even try to be a little optimistic. So not always easy for the intelligence community, but we're going to give it a shot here. How do you sort through the positive? Oh, sorry, this is from Donna Collier. How do you sort through the positives and the negatives from COVID-19, and how much room do you see for shaping a more positive future?
Well, as I said, I hope some positive good will come out of this. I mean, it really is an opportunity to rethink our healthcare system, to rethink our economic system, and I hope we take advantage of that opportunity. You know, in some ways, it's not as though we get to start from scratch, but we do get to start with both of those discredited, and maybe that'll lead to some real creativity. I think it's also going to be interesting as the first effect is going to be on people's lives, I think, and I don't think those will go back to where they were. I mean, I think partly it's going to be a long transition, but I think lots of people will find out that they actually liked working at home, maybe not all the time, but the number of companies before this that had any work at home was really like a third or a quarter. And so now we've had a huge surge in that. I think that's not going to change. I mean, I think that sense will continue, that how people lead their lives, they're going to have to lead them differently for a while, but even beyond that, I think there will be. But then that again raises the inequality problem, because as we've seen, you and I get to work at home. That's not so different from the way we worked before. We can even teach from home as you're doing. But for lots of people out there, particularly poorer people and minorities, they've got to be out there. And as a result, they're disproportionately dying from COVID. That ought to make us rethink that aspect of our economy as well.
Great. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the chat room now. So if anybody has any questions that they would really like to share, this is a great time to get on there and start to put them in there. This is from Elizabeth Cohen. What have the differences in outcomes around the world? For example, Germany versus Italy versus the US versus China. What do those differences tell us about optimal policy process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the the one that puzzles me most is really the fact that both we and many of the Europeans did badly. I can understand how we did badly. We had negative leadership from the top, but the other Europeans, with the exception of Germany, didn't do very well either. And that does raise the interesting question. Now, the British case looks a little bit like us with a lot of denial early on, but Italy not quite so. And so it is, I think what we learn is that mostly from Germany. Now, Germans are more critical of German performance than I would be, but Germany looks like they've done about as well as anybody, except maybe South Korea. And they did that by getting started early, by taking it seriously early, as I said, having tests available before they had a single confirmed case. And as a result, they've had a far lower death rate than Italy, and the two can't be that different in population profile. So again, what we learn, I think, is the countries that have done best have been ones that had a pretty orderly government, that had a respect for experts, and that started early.
Yeah. This one is from Niso Abwaf. And interesting question. What would have been different? I think he's referencing when you said, this kind of virus came from there's no threat actor behind the virus. He asks, what would have been different if this had been bioterrorism?
Well, there, I think not much would have necessarily been different, and we would have spent a lot of time trying to figure out where it came from. So that's always been something that's worried me since I've been thinking about this, and that is that this apparent threat without a threatener would be very difficult to distinguish, it seems to me, from something set loose. Now, the main reason in this case it seems like it wasn't a purposive threat is because it's hard to imagine the Chinese or anybody else doing that to their own population for whatever set of gains, but there are theories out there that suggest that. So that is one of the wickedest of the Wiccan problems of something like a pandemic, is that we wouldn't for some time, and maybe wouldn't ever, be entirely sure whether it was really a threat without a threatener or whether it came from a purposive threat. As I said, in this case, all we know suggests that it wasn't purposive, but there's still an awful lot we don't know, and we particularly don't know a lot about the early months, which look like October, not December, but more like October.
Great. So I think we have maybe 5 minutes. See if there's any other, here's one. Do you think the pattern of expanded executive powers across the world will carry through after the end of the crisis? So, the tendency, the temptation toward authoritarian or centralized control, how big a risk is that?
I think it's a pretty big risk. It's very much on my list. This is wonderful. I used to say that war may be hell, but it's pretty good for authoritarians, right? Mm-hmm. And to the extent this is like a war, it is. And we've seen Viktor Orban in Hungary and other leaders trying to expand their powers and using the emergency to do that. Even our own country, we've hard to imagine that $2 trillion done very quickly. So we've expanded government rather rapidly. We've also seen a lot of assertion of executive rights by the president. So this is, it seems to me, the emergency does give opportunity for both necessary increases in government role and maybe even executive authority, but also gives opportunities for authoritarians. We've seen that kind of around the world, from Orban to President Xi in China. And that will be, I think, a lingering effect, because once these things happen, they typically don't get turned off very easily. So I do think of that as one of the negative effects, among many negative effects, of the pandemic.
I think you could also make a case, though, that authoritarian regimes are among the more brittle too, right? So they look very stable for a long time, but when they break, they just break. And they can break under the kinds of shocks that you could see, right, proliferating out of something like COVID. So it could also see COVID undermining, maybe existing authoritarian governments that actually do fail to provide for their people at this point.
I think it's a big challenge even for China.
Yeah.
Our current view tends to see China as bigger and bigger and bigger and better and better and better, more and more of a threat. But it seems to me this is the combination of, a 6% drop in GDP with this evidence that will seep out slowly that they handle this pretty badly. That I think will be a challenge even for a country like China.
Here's another one. David Kamian. Apart from medical information, what intelligence, knowledge, unclassified information should allies definitely be sharing right now?
Other than medical, that is, huh?
I think, yes, other than medical. It's the maybe ancillary, the other second order sort of spillover things.
Well, this is time, it seems to me, where you'd like to have lots of sharing of good practices in medicine and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some of that. People looked at, for instance, what's gone on in Boston with tracking, as a Boston and Massachusetts with tracking. So it seems to be a time. This gets back to the medical problem, but even beyond, I think we'll learn a lot from how different countries open their economies. So that'll be a time when we're sharing lots of information and experience, so that maybe we can avoid, since some of the Europeans are probably going to open their economies sooner than we do, but we'll find out. We ought to learn lessons from them. So I say great worry, as in the Spanish flu of 1918, that we'll have a big second wave next winter. And so how we can avoid that is something we all have to be careful with. So I think this is really a time, ideally, and this doesn't sound like the world we're living in exactly, but this ought to be a time when we're sharing information, not just about the pandemic and the disease, but about things that seem to be useful both in combating it, but also in trying to resume normal economic life.
Great, and I think this will be our last question from the chat. This is from Chris Faulkner, McDonough, I think. I can only see Chris Faulkner dash. But what are the most fragile economic structures that are most likely to get shaken up?
I think we've seen already that the ones that are most at risk are the relatively small services. There it seems to me we will get some indications from Europe as they open, whether those cafes, bars, and other things can come back. Those are the ones that I think seem to me the most fragile, and I think that's a very big deal. Big chunks of what we think of as too breezily as economists as the service sector aren't going to survive this, I think, and that also may be a big change in the way people live their lives. If a lot of those locals we got used to don't exist anymore, that'll also change the way people go about their daily routine. So I suppose that's the piece that seems to me the most fragile. Those small, the mom and pops, the things that aren't big chains, those can probably survive, though they badly hurt. But it's the little ones that we sort of take for granted that I worry most about.
Yeah, and we're reading, because we're here in the New York area, we are watching New York City very carefully, obviously, because it's an epicenter, and the density there. Somebody was reminding me, Ed Glazer, who basically was writing, I think it was in the Times, and made the case that, cities have always been extremely vulnerable to contagious disease. We just haven't seen a lot of contagious disease in the last, several generations. And there was an article, I think it was yesterday, I was talking, maybe it was 2 days ago, talking about density and what the future of density might be in New York City. And that companies are seriously considering whether they can use the same amount of space, cram as many people into the same office spaces that they had in New York before as they can after. Like, will people be willing to work that close to each other? And if they're not, then it turns out that the office space itself becomes less, it's worth less to the tenants. And so the value of these properties begins to become affected too. So the ripple effects are just huge.
It's going to be interesting. Yeah, it's really going to be interesting to see what happens, because this does, people working at home, realizing they can do it, it's going to suggest to people, well, do I have to be there? Do I have to even be in that concentrated city? Maybe I can be in a place where I can have more land far away. And because we've seen the opposite happening, that now we've got, what, 50% of the US economy in 25 megacities, right? Mostly on the coasts. And interesting to imagine whether the possibilities of working at home will lead to significant dispersion. People saying, no, I don't want to make the commute every day. I'm quite happy to work here, mostly work at home. We'll see. I think that's going to be a sort of a counter trend to the concentration we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a cost to that trend. But of course, the trend was there. The underlying trend was there for a reason. That kind of density seems to have, productive spillovers, and people seem to like some parts of it. So we'll see. So we're going to end because it is been an hour. It's gone fast. I will say I'm just going to do a couple thank yous and closes, but Greg and I will stay on the line for another 15 minutes. I'm going to take maybe like a 2-minute break. So as people get off, and then we can kind of resume with some chat questions if people would like to do that. But before everybody goes, I just want to say thank you to Greg for joining us.
My pleasure.
And for agreeing to stay a few more minutes too. We really do hope that people have enjoyed the conversation tonight, that it's helped to disentangle some of the threads, some of the complexity in the ongoing crisis. We also hope that it's helping you to frame some risks, but maybe also see some opportunities in the future. It's and have some reason for optimism. I also wanted to let everyone know before you sign off that we'd like to send a feedback form or survey out in the next few days, just so you could give us your thoughts as we plan ahead for next year. We really, really want to make our programming as valuable and meaningful as possible to the community. So please let us know what you thought about tonight and also what you think you might like to see. Best to everyone. Please stay healthy and strong. And thank you so, so much for joining us tonight. Goodbye. Hey, I see a bunch of people still here, which is awesome. And I'm hoping people, let's see how many we have. I think we could probably just go with people unmuting. So I'm going to unmute everyone. If you would like to stay muted, you just have to kind of remute yourself. But I think at this point we could just do that. Okay, so people are unmuted. We've been hearing you.
You want to start my video again?
Sure. Okay, I actually ended up muting people again because obviously unmuting them, they have stuff going on in the background. But you now can all freely unmute yourselves if you want to. You should be able to. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask Greg while we still have him?
I have a question for Greg. This is David Camion. Hi, Roz.
Hi, David.
Oh, hey, David. Hi.
Great to hear your voice.
Likewise.
So,
Roz, you want to turn my video back on?
Yep, I do. I think I might be asking you to do that.
Okay.
You might get a signal from me.
So I'd like to ask one more question. If you could put on a fictional hat and you were in the National Security Council, what would you be asking intelligence to tell you now?
I think I'd be most interested probably in forensics. I think I'd like them to continue to dig into how the origins of this, which has an intelligence dimension to it, it seems to me, since it is in that sense a puzzle, but a difficult puzzle, and one the Chinese have not been very helpful in letting us solve. So I guess I think I would look to intelligence for that. That's I usually think about strategic intelligence, not forensic stuff, but I think that's probably what I'd be interested in.
And going forward, one more quick follow on, would it be important, in the years to come, to assess the vulnerabilities of all our trading partners to a future pandemic?
Yes, I think that would be. one of the things we did at the NIC before I got there was looked, and I think for this reason it remained a classified paper, but it looked at basically the vulnerability of different countries to climate change as what was going to be the effect on various countries. So I think that would be a very legitimate, though difficult, sensitive intelligence question, because it's one of the things that intelligence doesn't, life is good at doing, but doesn't want to do openly is make commentaries, judgments about particular countries, particularly if they're friends. But that would be, I think, a useful thing to do.
Thank you.
I don't know if we have anybody else in our chat or who wants to be brave. Oh, Niso, there we go.
Well, I was wondering, as is suggested by some internet blogs, has China become the winner as a result of this?
Well, so far it seems to me they have, which is pretty amazingly nifty when you think about it, right? Having unleashed this on the world, by now they look like they're not only the model in dealing with it, but the leader in trying to help other people deal with it. So my guess is that won't last. But so far they've managed a pretty amazing pivot from defense to offense. And so far it seems to me it's done okay. My guess is it won't last because people will understand more about where this came from and will get more cynical, I think, about Chinese assistance after Chinese stockpiling. But yeah, so far it'd be hard to say they haven't come out of this the winner.
I'm pretty skeptical of the numbers, aren't you? Like when they went from, I don't know, 80,000 to like 0,
Yeah,
it doesn't make any sense. Like there's just no way. But, so we just don't know the numbers either.
No.
Greg, could you talk more, and I'm sorry, I'm in darkness,
Okay.
talk more about the value of experts and whether maybe the political leadership will understand the value of experts? Will this change people's views, particularly the leadership? And I'm not saying the current president, but maybe other political leaders about the benefits of listening to expertise, and or the public.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, when I look at the poll results, people do trust experts. Something like the people trust experts, scientists, let's say, scientists as much as they trust the military and police. So it's 80+% of people say they have a good deal or a lot of trust in scientists. So what it seems to me we have is a kind of a powerful set of movements, the anti-vaxxers and others that are disbelieve in science for different reasons. So we have that kind of paradox that the people are more confident in scientists than many of our leaders have been. I hope that will change as people will say, look, we're not listening to the experts got us. It got us a lot more dead people than we needed to have. So I hope that'll be one of the outcomes, because it is the paradox that the people are more confident in science than many of our leaders have been, at least recently. I don't want to be too political, but you can imagine, it's hard to imagine another administration that wouldn't have gotten out of the way, let Fauci be the spokesperson for the whole government. But that isn't what's happened this time around. And that's, I think there'll be a backlash against that as people say, well, wait a minute, we've gotten very mixed signals. Why didn't we just listen to the experts and get to hear them all the time?
I'm wondering, do you think there's going to be any backlash against the United States for anything I'm thinking about, or unanticipated risk? So I think about, President Trump closing the immigration down, and I'm thinking to myself, how many people really want, how many people really want Americans emigrating outside at this point? We're sort of the center of of the epidemic at this point. So this idea, like we're trying to keep everybody out, like the risk is out there, right? When the risk is here. And you wonder, like, do we have a sense of how people are viewing the risk that's emanating out of the United States? And are we not anticipating blocks against our own travel, blocks against our own people that might come up and create some problems?
Well, I think that's entirely possible. The two big things that have happened is, one, we've been sort of negative leaders. So any claim we have to be a world leader has been diminished by this episode. And maybe just as bad, we've looked incompetent. So I've often thought that one of the great strengths of the United States was that we actually looked like we were reasonably competent, could maybe be counted on if we said we'd do something. Well, in this case, we've neither said we would do something, nor have we been competent in doing it. So you can imagine people, as you suggest, Ross, saying, well, if they're this bad at handling the disease, maybe we shouldn't let Americans come here. Maybe we should make them quarantine for 2 weeks, even months from now. So I do think there'll be some of those effects.
Yeah.
So, Greg, I wanted to pick up on the fragile question I asked earlier. And thanks, by the way, for coming to talk with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So I've been struck by how many people think that it's possible to turn the economy off and then turn it back on like a light switch, and for it to be basically like a recovery from a hurricane. What do you think, I mean, how do you assess that question? Because it also too seems like a bit of a wicked problem, right? How do you restart the economy?
Yeah. No, I think two big things about that. One is you're exactly right. People have an imagination this is going to be quick. You and I know it's going to be very piecemeal, very slow, that, it's a matter of a year or more, several years probably, before we even are open in the way we used to think of open. And that'll be if we're lucky and have a vaccine that works and we get enough of it to vaccinate everybody. So this is going to be I think a long, piecemeal and slow process. In that sense, it's sort of the opposite, it seems to me, of after a war, right? After a war, you've got lots of things that need to be rebuilt and lots of pent-up demand. Now what we've got is we're going to have long, slow demand, right? So it's going to be, I think, a much longer process than most people think.
Miso, is that you? Yeah.
Yes, that's me. Well, thanks again. How does this pandemic change the relationship between enemies or adversaries, such as Iran and the United States, Israel and the Palestinians?
I fear in the short run, it doesn't change it much at all. I think the way we've dealt with Iran is really very short-sighted, because we know that even in our own narrow self-interest, if the disease is rampant in Iran, that just makes it all the more likely it'll come back here. So it seems to me we ought to be cooperating with them to help them get better control of the disease there. But that's not what we're doing, and it isn't the case elsewhere in the Middle East either. So it seems to be just a sadness that I wish we could get around. It does seem like politics has driven things that it shouldn't drive when so many lives are at stake.
On that point too, I mean, there's pressure now to provide some sanctions relief just out of humanitarian concern. So this idea that, you have sanctions on places that are going through just these massive, COVID crises, and, will we just end up getting blamed, for, an excess of humanitarian suffering because, we couldn't relieve even on medical supplies, for a short period of time on some places.
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, George Kennan said long ago about the Soviet Union, he said the hard part about dealing with the Soviet Union is you couldn't help the people without helping the government. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't hurt the government without hurting the people. And what we've done with Iran is sort of what we did with Cuba. We've given the leadership a pass. They can blame everything on us and sanctions, right? Yeah. And a lot of this is mismanagement there. And lots of Iranians see that, but can't, I think, say it in current circumstances when we're, keeping the pressure on even through this pandemic. So
Yeah.
I think, on humanitarian grounds, it's awful, but I also think in sort of realpolitik grounds, it's just a disaster to sort of force people to be welded to a government that many of them don't like because we're the boogeyman.
Yeah.
Greg, can I ask a funny question? Or it's not a funny, it's a maybe a broader question. Do the winners write history, or does the truth write history?
Oh, I think most of the winners write it, don't you think? I mean, we hope they tell the truth at some point, but mostly I think the winners get to write history. I guess that's maybe a sadness. One of the things in intelligence that's hardest is, but really important, I think, is helping political leaders see how the rest of the world thinks about us, right? Because we Americans, I think, believe almost as a matter of nature that we typically are on the side of the angels and that the whole world sees that. That's hardly the case, and certainly not the case now. So we probably won't get to write the history of this episode, but maybe we will. Hope so.
All right, maybe if there's one more, but it's 10-2.
Well, thank you. This has been a treat for me.
It's been great.
One last question, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah,
So, are you worried about complacency? And the reason I ask that is, if you think about what's happened, with frustration about wanting to reopen the states and down south, but maybe they'll have to shut back down. But at some point, say in June, right, there will be a point where it actually makes sense to reopen, and yet you kind of know that a second wave is coming. So how should we be thinking about those risks and monitoring those risks of being complacent and not letting our guard down against what could be a next second wave?
Yeah, the track we're on almost guarantees a second wave. I'm not an epidemiologist, but it just seems to me that the pressure to do something and open in ways that we probably shouldn't too soon. I mean, the real key is we're still way behind on testing, and until we can really do testing, and testing a lot, right? Testing almost anybody who wants it every day. That's otherwise we get this recipe for a second wave. It seems to me, as we open up and then it goes explodes again. It's amazing that 3 months into this, we're still doing less than 200,000 tests a day, when we ought to be doing, I suppose, at least 500,000, maybe 1 million a day. If we can, that's got to ramp up. That's the first thing, because people talk about flattening the curve, but I've come to think of it as only extending the curve, right? And all we're doing is buying time, and we're buying time presumably to not overwhelm hospitals, to hope we get better treatments, and especially to get enough capability to test and track people.
Yep. We're heading toward 100,000 cases in New Jersey probably this week. So I hear what you're saying about it. It is just extending the curve right now. We are not making enough progress.
But I will also say, and we're doing some surveys on this, it's really about, testing will allow people to be comfortable. If they know that they're resistant, then they can go out and, allows the recovery, right? So that's something we've been focused on. And
we're still, even with those kind of antibody tests, we're hardly beginning, right?
Right.
So the testing really is, for me, the priority over the next few months.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. It was fun just to kind of roam all over a lot of issues and hear your thoughts on lots of things. I'll be back in touch afterward. I'll share any feedback, and we can continue our conversation also.
Okay, great. All righty. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Greg.
you so much. Sorry I
Thank
didn't get to
you.
participate too much, but I heard. I appreciate it.
Okay, great.